What do Space Mountain, George Lucas, and the Brown Derby restaurant at Disney's Hollywood Studios have in common? They're each significant plot points in the story of Star Wars Galaxy's Edge. And if you really think about it, Disney World has practically had 5 theme parks. Yes, you heard that right. And I'm not talking about our previous video where I made the case for a potential 5th Disney park. I'm talking about something else. There's Magic Kingdom, Epcot, Animal Kingdom, and Hollywood Studios. But for those of you who are just getting into Disney's Hollywood Studios with its relatively recent edition of Star Wars Galaxy's Edge, you might be surprised to find out that the Hollywood Studios you see today was a completely different park not even 10 years ago. And for this May the 4th, I thought it would be really cool to do a deep dive into the history of Star Wars Galaxy's Edge, which, despite being only 5 years old, is a story that spans across over 4 decades. But before we do, be sure to like this video down below, subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, and don't forget that we're live on Patreon. So if you'd like to stay up to date, get credited, and have a direct say in more videos like these, please consider becoming a patron. We'd love to have you. Alright, so before we begin, I want to reassure you that this video is not going to feel like a Star Wars video at certain points. There's a lot of information to cover and lots of Disney relevant history to tie in, but I can promise you it'll all make sense. So sit back, relax, grab a snack, and enjoy the greatest Star Wars story you've heard in years. Alright, so back in the mid-1980s, around 1984, when Michael Eisner became CEO of the Walt Disney Company, the company was at its worst place since the 1940s. You see, after Walt passed away in 1966, Roy and the Imagineers went on to complete the Magic Kingdom and its surrounding hotels. But in terms of a long-term plan, they didn't really have much. Walt's initial plan for Epcot was seen as too ambitious, and aside from the fact that they did not have a succession plan in place, which is kind of morbidly funny to me because Walt was a kid at heart and probably thought he was gonna live forever, the company's film division, which was very obviously a serious portion of their revenue at the time, was also performing terribly. And the cherry on top of all of this, which got worse and worse throughout the 70s and the early 80s, were numerous hostile buyout attempts from vulture capitalists who were taking advantage of the company's poor performance and dissatisfied investors and employees to take over. So it was an absolute mess. Meanwhile, over at Lucasfilm, George Lucas had just launched what was the beginning of a mega franchise that would change the world forever. Now, the peculiar thing was that despite having absolutely no association with the Walt Disney Company at this time, immediately after the release of the original Star Wars, Space Mountain, which had opened at Walt Disney World several years prior, and just a couple days after Star Wars at Disneyland, began attracting a massive influx of Star Wars moviegoers. And if you can't tell, that's just a little bit of foreshadowing for you, but stay tuned because we've got a little bit more history to get through first. Despite Epcot eventually succeeding as a theme park, the company had finally exhausted all of Walt's unrealized ideas, so they actually had to get creative at this point. And I use the word creative more loosely than that tooth you thought would kill you if you just manned up and yanked it out of your mouth as a child. So here's what happened. As the story goes, then Paramount CEO Michael Eisner allegedly sat in on the Universal Studios Florida pitch meeting, gathering all the information he possibly could about their truly innovative idea for a cross between a functioning production studio and a theme park. A studio theme park, before flipping around to Disney and putting in motion their own studio theme park, which is said to have had the exact same layout as the original design for Universal Studios. But Disney had another problem, and that was the fact that unlike Universal, live-action films were not a core part of their brand, and so they collaborated with MGM Studios to create various attractions which would include great familiarity with classic Golden Age films, namely the Great Movie Ride, which took you through a tour of classic films from Mary Poppins to The Public Enemy with James Cagney, all the way to The Wizard of Oz. This park also included a fully functioning backlot and animation studio where guests could actually watch animators animate films like Beauty and the Beast in real time. I also think it'd be cool to mention that during this time, Michael Eisner was simultaneously working close with Walt Disney Animation Studios and its new collaborators Howard Ashman and Alan Menken to bring a whole new world of Disney films to life, which would go on to be known as the Disney Renaissance, and opened with The Little Mermaid in theaters the same year as Disney MGM Studios in 1989. Just 3 years later, it got its own attraction at the park, a miniature Broadway-style show known as Voyage of the Little Mermaid. But despite this, that didn't change the fact that this park did not retain guests in the same way that the Magic Kingdom and Epcot did. For example, if a family were to take a 5-day vacation to Disney World, they might have stayed at the Magic Kingdom for 2 days, Epcot for 2 days, maybe head over to MGM for the first few hours of the 5th day, and then they'd leave. Or if you were a local, Disney MGM was usually a half-day park, but that was until a new attraction opened at Disney MGM in late 1989, Star Tours. You see, in 1979, following the trend of many people associating Star Wars with Tomorrowland, as previously seen in 1977, with lines for Space Mountain stretching all the way to Main Street, USA, Disney produced a film called The Black Hole. It was an attempt to not outsource, but rather compete with Star Wars and see if they could create anything that would bring opportunities for new Tomorrowland attractions. However, the film was an absolute bomb, and this might actually have you wondering, why wouldn't Disney have just reached out to Lucas to collaborate on Star Wars films and potential theme park attractions? Well, the answer to that is kind of complicated, and here's why. If you are a massive Star Wars fan, you are likely well aware of the fact that George Lucas is not a man known for being widely respected by big media executives. He never has been, and he still isn't today. And despite being mostly subjective, there are a couple of reasons for this. The biggest and most relevant being that he has always been openly critical about the fact that the vast majority of Hollywood executives do not care about creativity, nor are they creatively inclined. And as a man who valued and continues to value storytelling and quality over mere profit for the sake of profit, he's always tended to avoid rubbing elbows with these people. And from their profit for the sake of profit standpoint, they likely avoided him because they knew that by working with him, he would demand and require that he have a say in the process. Despite being snubbed by nearly everyone in the industry, George Lucas went on to do things like omit opening credits from his films, despite the Directors Guild of America telling him he couldn't, and going on to produce generation-defining films despite being treated like shit. But in spite of the industry being taken aback, perhaps even becoming resentful of Lucas's vision and success, one Hollywood executive was, in fact, impressed. That man was, of course, Michael Eisner. Shortly after the release of Star Wars, Lucas was putting forth in motion another film with Harrison Ford, Raiders of the Lost Ark. But yet again, studios weren't having it with Lucas's aggressive creative vision and what he deemed fair financial terms of distribution. But Eisner said, "Come over to my house, Georgie. Let's make a deal. The greatest deal Hollywood has ever seen." And with that, Raiders of the Lost Ark was in motion. But even after Paramount agreed to produce it, and its subsequent success, Star Wars continued to soar above Indiana Jones. For a brief moment, Disney even considered George Lucas for CEO, but he wasn't interested. With Michael Eisner's inevitable move to Disney, now dealing with the inherited mess, as you might remember us discussing earlier, the Paramount-Lucasfilm relationship became a Disney-Lucasfilm relationship almost instantaneously, because more than anything, what brought Indiana Jones to life was the growing relationship between Michael Eisner and George Lucas. With Michael Eisner now in charge, and with the help of executives Jeffrey Katzenberg and Frank Wells, this is where things started to get interesting. Eisner, so kindly continuing their relationship from Paramount and not thinking about money whatsoever, offered Lucas $1 million for every attraction at every park for each year of its operation. Lucas was sold. And I said that last part kind of sarcastically because I do believe that Michael Eisner at least somewhat cared about Lucas's vision, but regardless, once Lucas was on board, legendary Imagineer Tony Baxter pitched a Star Wars simulator ride, and other Imagineers pitched various roller coaster ideas before they finally agreed that the attraction they could build most efficiently with the available technology at their disposal, namely with the help of Lucas's Industrial Lights and Magic business, which was responsible for visual effects as far back as the original Star Wars film, was the simulator ride, which would go on to be named Star Tours. While all of this was going on, Michael Jackson came out of nowhere and declared that he wanted to collaborate with Disney on his own attraction, and specifically asked for the help of either Steven Spielberg or, of course, George Lucas. Mind you, Star Wars was already extremely expensive, labor-intensive, and was pushing Disney's technology to the limits. But the executives couldn't pass off an opportunity to work with him, and with Spielberg unavailable, Lucas agreed to write the 17-minute film that would become Captain EO, featuring Michael Jackson, to show guests at Disneyland Park. Undeterred by quitting and replacement actors, Captain EO and Star Tours were completed. Believe it or not, Captain EO actually worked in their favor, because without it, and a sole focus on Star Tours, they likely would have gone way over budget. Now when I say Star Tours was huge, I mean that it was an absolute sensation, and just 2 years after it opened at Disneyland, a replica opened at none other than Disney MGM Studios. There, it was equally popular. And as you might imagine, Disney realized that they were onto something with a merge between the Disney and Star Wars brands. And so in 1997, Disney launched a new special event at MGM called Star Wars Weekends. These occurred yet again in 2000 and 2001 before becoming a 5 to 6 week long event that would take place in the park from 2003 to 2015, where guests could meet Jedi Mickey and other characters from the Star Wars franchise, visit the Jedi Training Academy, watch a fireworks show accompanied by John Williams scores, and so many other things. I mean, talk about solving the low theme park attendance issue we had talked about earlier in the story, because these were ridiculously popular festivals. To put it into perspective how popular these were, MGM, which became Disney's Hollywood Studios in 2008, was my all-time favorite Disney park growing up, but I liked it because of the old Golden Age vibe, not for the Star Wars vibe. Things like the Great Movie Ride, Streets of America, the Studio Backlot Tour, Lights, Motors, Action, and even the Sorcerer's Hat, none of which exist anymore, yet all of which were my thing growing up and left a lasting impact on me. Hell, I wouldn't know who James Cagney or Jean Harlow were if it weren't for the Great Movie Ride. And looking back, I can distinctly remember how much I hated these events growing up because they made this decently empty park that I absolutely loved insanely crowded with a franchise I didn't really care for. And this brings us to 2011, when Disney was seeking a way to compete with Universal Studios once again, as they were now moving forward with the creation of a Harry Potter-themed world by a little-known author by the name of J.K. Rowling. And yes, I say little-known yet again, because the last time I sarcastically referred to the most successful author in history as little-known, some nincompoop lost their in the comments. This world was known as the Wizarding World of Harry Potter. New CEO Bob Iger knew that a successful opening of the Wizarding World would mean that all the Star Wars work that had been done on Hollywood studios would become obsolete, and so he needed a plan. On May 20th, 2011, both George Lucas and Bob Iger worked at Disney's Hollywood Studios to announce a new version of Star Tours called Star Tours: The Adventures Continue, which would include many more variations of the ride. After the celebration, the two had lunch at the Hollywood Brown Derby, just across the way from where the Great Movie Ride once was. And it was here where Bob Iger first proposed to Lucas the most ambitious thing Disney had ever asked of him. to acquire Lucasfilm. After extensive negotiations, Lucas pondering on his future as he was preparing to have a daughter, and even providing Disney with his visions for a third trilogy, he finally agreed to sell his company to Disney for $4 billion. Born from this sale was a sequel trilogy and the concept for an immersive themed land based on the first 6 films. Initially, the Imagineers toyed with the idea of replacing the Echo Lake and Indiana Jones stunt spectacular section of Hollywood Studios with a land based on Tatooine and Endor. But this idea was scrapped after Iger saw the initial footage from the sequel trilogy and was confident that they could build a new planet based on the aesthetics of that trilogy. This planet, canon with the franchise but not present in any pre-existing Star Wars media, was named Batuu, and would include opportunities to try blue milk, experience the movies in person rather than watch how they were made, a contrast from what was there before, meet your favorite characters as well as new ones, and visit your favorite droids and ships like the Millennium Falcon, and walk through new locations like the Black Spire Outpost, a place only briefly named in Solo: A Star Wars Story. The land was designed like a labyrinth, creating the illusion of being much larger than it actually is, as guests have to make numerous twists and turns to get through it, making you feel like you're walking through something much larger than 14 acres, which is about how large the land would be. The design team even traveled to places like Istanbul, Morocco, Jerusalem, and Egypt to gather inspiration and experience the different open-air markets such as the Grand Bazaar in Turkey and the Mahana Yehuda Shuk in Israel, as well as the various cultures which might reflect the ambiance of Galaxy's Edge. As for the landscape, the giant spires at Galaxy's Edge, which appear to be rock formations, are actually intended to be the petrified remains of ancient trees. In 2015, Disney announced what would be publicly titled Star Wars Galaxy's Edge in 2017 at the D23 Expo. And following the closing of Lights Motors Action Extreme Stunt Show, Streets of America, and the Honey, I Shrunk the Kids movie set adventure on April 2, 2016, preceded by the closing of the studio backlot tour in 2014, construction began on the new Star Wars-themed land, both at Disneyland and at the Walt Disney World Resort on April 14, 2016. Finally, on March 7, 2019, Star Wars Galaxy's Edge opened at Walt Disney World and later that same year at Disneyland, with just one attraction, Millennium Falcon Smuggler's Run. Soon after, however, Star Wars Rise of the Resistance opened, and is housed to this day inside one of the largest show buildings ever built for a Disney ride. The land also opened with numerous restaurants like Oga's Cantina, as well as with numerous kiosks. 3 years later, in 2022, Disney opened the Galactic Star Cruiser, a role-play hotel experience with direct access to the park, costing between a whopping $4,800 and $6,000 for 2 nights. This was short-lived, as you might imagine, and closed just over a year later. And that brings us to today. So if someone were to ask you, how long did the Disney Lucasfilm deal take? You just tell them, many, many decades, because it didn't even start at Disney. Now before we go, you might be wondering, what is your opinion on Galaxy's Edge? Do you like the changes to Hollywood Studios? Do you not like the changes to Hollywood Studios? And despite now finding the stories to the original 6 Star Wars films entertaining, considering George Lucas a genius, marveling at the level of depth and lore within the franchise, and understanding why Galaxy's Edge and lands like Toy Story Land are far more commercial than Streets of America, the Backlot Tour, and Lights Motors Action, I do not like Galaxy's Edge whatsoever. Not only is it based off the aesthetics of the Disney-made sequel trilogy, which die-hard Star Wars fans can probably agree with me in that they are objectively poor movies that don't even feel canon with the first 6, the land itself does not even make sense. I get what they were trying to do, as we talked about before. They were trying to make their own planet as opposed to sticking a replica of, I don't know, Naboo or Tatooine into a theme park, trying to maintain some of the early Disney principles of rides and attractions based off original ideas rather than IP. But my whole thing is, if you're gonna make an IP-themed land, you might as well just go all the way with something people already know and wish they could experience in real life. And I feel the exact same way about Toy Story Land. I really don't see how this crowded concrete jungle with no shade whatsoever is supposed to make me feel like I'm in Andy's backyard. They could have built a gigantic 5-to-1 scale replica of Al's Toy Barn or something like Pizza Planet, where you could actually get alien slime out of the machine. It's not a budget problem at all. None of this is a budget problem. These are strictly problems born of poor management and creativity. What do you guys think? Once again, don't forget to like, subscribe, and visit our Patreon, and let me know in the comments what you think about Galaxy's Edge. Thanks for watching, and may the 4th be with you.